This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. There's a good deal of energy in the development and humanitarian space focused on building an evidence base for what works and what doesn't. Here on the Terms of Reference podcast, we've talked with numerous individuals and organizations who are building data sets towards that end, and the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, has been contributing to this conversation since its founding in 2008. To date, they've funded 146 impact evaluations, 33 systematic reviews, and 38 other studies in over 50 countries. But how do we properly reflect on and communicate about the evidence we've collected and its resulting analysis so that it can be used by development and humanitarian actors to design and deliver better programming? I discuss this and a host of other topics on the 114th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast with my guest, Dr. Jyotsna Puri. Joe is the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Evaluation at 3IE and has more than 21 years of experience in policy research and development evaluation. I spoke with Joe in Delhi. Hello, Joe. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. My privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So you work for an organization called 3IE, which is the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. Where are you sitting today? I know the work takes you all over the world, but where are you sitting today?
I'm sitting in warm Delhi. It's a very balmy 39 degrees outside. And it's about 7:50 in the evening.
Oh, boy. Nothing like 39 degrees at 7 in the evening. I've been there. I've done that. I know exactly what you're talking about. Why don't we start off, tell us, 3IE was started in 2008. Its goal is to provide evidence, right, about what works and what doesn't work in development and the humanitarian space. Why don't you tell us, now it's 2016, you're 6 years into this. I'm not sure how long you've been with the organization, but tell us a little bit more about the goals and missions of the organization and what it is that your work that you specifically focus on.
Sure. Thanks so much. So yes, we were started in 2008, so that makes us about 8 years old. 3IE was born out of a fairly widespread recognition that there was very little evidence to inform us about what works, what doesn't, why, and for how much. And so quite a few good, innovative people got together and founded 3IE. And Howard White is our founding director. And currently we have our second executive director who's on, and his name is Manny Jimenez. And 3IE is a member-based organization whose main mandate is really to help produce high-quality evidence to inform what works, what doesn't, for development policy and development assistance. Yeah, so we were born out of this fairly large, widespread angst, so to speak. And I think we're 8 years later, we're sort of at a point where we're looking back to see what are we learning and how can we inform development assistance policy, but also humanitarian assistance as we go further along.
So it begs the question, what have you learned? So, are there 3 or 4 big bullet points that, or maybe there's more, that you think has been definitive in your work over the last 8 years that you're now feeding to policymakers or at least advocating?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we're realizing is that impact evaluation, systematic review. So that's sort of the forms of evidence that we concentrate on, while recognizing, of course, that evidence can come in many ways and forms. But really, impact evaluation, systematic reviews, and other forms of evidence have been really seminal in informing some of the big questions, and I'm calling them big with a specific reason, because they are really the big questions of our time, and they have started to inform them very nicely. It's been a gestation period, clearly, but I think we have some answers now. So to give some examples, I think just to pick up from where you left off, which was really, and talking about humanitarian context, one of the key questions has been, what works in humanitarian situations to make people better off? And we've seen very good evaluations, very good assessments and studies being done. We've seen good research being done. But I remember when we looked at this question in 2014, I realized with some shock that although just in the previous 10 years, more than $100 billion had been spent in this area, there was very little evidence to tell working and what's not. Pan ahead, and we're in 2016 now, and I can tell you that because of the evidence that has been produced in the interim period, that humanitarian agencies are recognizing, for example, that cash works. Yeah. So, and this is also based on very, very good, high quality reviews that have been done, which collected good impact evaluations in turn to then systematically meta-analyze the data and then said, okay, let's look at the cash-based approaches that have been used, for example, in Lebanon, in DRC, in Niger, in Yemen, in Ecuador, etc. But then let's also compare competing programs. So let's look at cash for work and vouchers, and then try and understand as to what works, and cash works. Yeah. So that's one. Another big question, I think, of our times is what works to take people out of poverty? And again, I think for as long as I've been on this earth, and I'm sure you as well, one of the biggest questions that has really been pretty difficult for a lot of policymakers as well as decision makers to try and answer in a definitive sort of way is can people really be taken out of ultra poverty, and what combination of programs should it be? And now we have a pretty good body of work that shows that yes, it is possible to take people out, to graduate people out of ultra poverty, and by giving them a combination of asset transfers, consumption related transfers, training, coaching, etc., and essentially enable them to start small businesses, which in turn then helps them to escape sort of the vicious circle of poverty. I mean, I can go on, but one of the important things that it also makes me focus on is what are we learning that's about things that are not working, but we are putting in lots and lots of money into it. Mm-hmm. So one example of that is, for example, a lot of resources and money has been spent on payment for ecosystem services. And this is, climate change is, again, one of the big problems of our times. And one of the big instruments that a lot of organizations use is to pay people to save forests and to not cultivate land. And that's sort of put together in the form of programs that are called payment for ecosystem services. But again, really good impact evaluations that have been done across the developing world, looking at swaths of forests which are extremely precious and where there are smallholder farmers. And when that evidence has been aggregated, you found that despite a lot of resources being put into this space, payment for ecosystem services at best has a very marginal effect on reducing deforestation and really does not actually merit the big policy change that you're bringing about through this big investment. So, I mean, I can go on, but I think that sort of gives you some flavor as well.
Absolutely. Is there one either success, let's call it a success, right, where you've done the research and you said, yes, this works, like you said, cash works, or perhaps even something counterintuitive like the smallholder farmer issue that you were just talking about? Is there one that stands out in your mind that has just been a major shock, either internally at 3IE or something that you're out there advocating for it, that people are like, wow, we really thought this worked, but the evidence just doesn't show it, that everybody's just sort of jaw on the table?
Big shock in terms of, I have to confess, to me, primarily because a lot of my work has been in the environment and the policy space to understand what works in the environment sector. I have to confess that my big shock was the evidence that we're seeing on decentralized forest management systems, on community-based forest management systems, as well as on payment for ecosystem services. That we cannot, despite all of the resources, despite all of the attention that's paid to implementation, despite all of the engagement that's done with community-level stakeholders and with government stakeholders, that we have not been able to make that a win-win option. And given the big trade-offs that there obviously are between agriculture on one side, you do need to clear land to cultivate food, for example, and to feed people, and saving forests and mitigating climate change represents a fairly big disappointment for me as well.
Sorry to hear that. I didn't mean to sort of prod you into something that was a pretty big disappointment. How do you go about choosing what it is that the organization will be looking at? You talked about, again, cash. You talked about how do people graduate out of extreme poverty. You're just talking about some environmental issues. Who sets the agenda at 3IE, or how does that get set?
Yeah, thanks. Stephen, I'm head of evaluation at 3IE. That does not by any way mean that there's one central person or a group of us get together to essentially decide as to what the big questions are 3IE gets to answer. I think a lot of it is fairly organic. It's sort of built through quite a bit of dialogue with interested stakeholders, what we call friendlies, some of which are donors, but then others that are just implementing agencies. But then we also inform ourselves by the zeitgeist, just looking at the SDGs, or looking at the international policy climate, that the big questions today are humanitarian assistance, and that it's governance, and that it's climate change. So I think that sort of helps to give us a lens or really shift focus into areas so that we start to ask those questions internally. And then we use instruments such as evidence gap maps, for instance, and that helps us to understand as to what is the quality of evidence that we can find in a specific area or for a particular question. And that really gets us going. But I do want to say it's not as systematic as I'm describing it. A lot of it is also born out of just sheer curiosity, and a lot of it is also demand-driven. So if UNICEF comes to us and says, well, we really want to understand whether our programs that are directed at adolescent girls in India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are working or not, and we really want to try and compare it with evidence across the world, well, that definitely puts the limelight and the spotlight, on those questions. But on the other hand, I remember we started to look at transparency and accountability governance in the natural resource area. And we realized, very much like the humanitarian case, that despite there being a huge potential of about $330 billion in Africa, just in the area of natural resource governance, not a single impact evaluation had been done. These are sort of organic processes. They're informed by a variety of stakeholders. And I have to confess that the demand for knowing as to what the evidence is and how strong is that evidence and can we produce more is far greater than our capacity to deal with those.
There's a whole host of questions there. What happens when you have an answer? For instance, cash works. I know that there was a big cash conversation at the World Humanitarian Summit recently. Do you also have an advocacy arm that you go out and you start beating the drum and say, hey, we have an answer, everybody really needs to listen? Or is the information out there? How effective have you been sort of getting it out there, and what's the response been from the community? Do you get pushback?
Yeah, great question. I mean, actually, when 3IE was formed, it was quite interesting. We shied away from advocating for positions on evidence. So we do have an advocacy office, but our main advocacy is done for producing high quality policy relevant evidence. So we don't take positions on the evidence itself. So I was at the World Humanitarian Summit, and my role there was to say, look, you have to pursue more better evidence in the area of humanitarian assistance, because guess what? Despite all of the money that's being poured into it, money is not the answer. And we know this because we've looked at development assistance, and we know that just because you're pouring money into it doesn't mean it's working. And the same lessons can be used by you. So when I was at the bully pulpit, that's what I was talking about. I wasn't necessarily forcing people and organizations to take positions around cash. I was putting it in front of them and saying, this is what our systematic review that we've quality assured, and that's been done by Shannon Ducey and her colleague from Johns Hopkins, is saying, and use it as you will, but at least look at the high quality evidence we have there and start to think about similar evidence for other questions as well.
From when you're up on that pulpit, as you say, or maybe you don't see this now, but perhaps others throughout the organization, do they get pushback? Do you see people saying, yes, okay, you say cash works, but that's not the right answer for us? Or maybe, or people say, hey, in our situation, we know that cash doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z. Do you find that sometimes the conversations break down, or is it people saying, oh, wow, we're grateful to have this evidence and we want to use it?
Yeah, so the first part of my answer is yes, of course. But, because I don't take a position on the policy recommendation that's coming out of the evidence, it's not as if they're rejecting the evidence. It's essentially saying, well, so even the systematic review that I can refer to, and almost all of the cases that I refer to in terms of answering the big questions, are based on good review work, right? And that in turn are informed by good, high-quality evaluations. So if people reject the policy recommendation, it's essentially a rejection of the recommendation by saying, well, it doesn't apply to my context, which I completely understand, because a lot of this evidence is really at the global level. You're putting together systematic reviews and you're really looking at the evidence across a variety of contexts for a variety of people and really meta-analyzing it. So I completely understand that, what applies to Nepal may not apply to Colombia, for example. And so at the country level, the dialogue is very different. The dialogue is very much around pursue evidence. And so for me, the part that bothers me is when I get pushback on evidence. It's not so much when I get pushback on the policy position.
What about a meta look? Does your organization also sort of look at the meta on top of all of these pieces of work? And where my mind is going right now is that our industry, the development industry, is extraordinarily broad, very wide in the topics that it seeks to address. Do people come to you to ask, what do we do first? Is there a prioritization about how we should look at this evidence to say, okay, first cash and then, agriculture issues, or first we definitely need to think about bringing the poor out of poverty at pretty much any expense, but then we can think about other things. Do you have that kind of work as well?
So you're asking me, do people come to us to give them to advise them on what positions they might take in how they design their programs or policies?
Not only that, but also whether there's a prioritization or, because you have such a huge body of knowledge that you've been developing. Is there a way to say, hey, we know that before you start to do cash programs, maybe you should do X, Y, and Z? I'm completely shooting in the dark here, but maybe just wondering if that exists.
Not so much that. So I'm trying to think of it, a cogent example to give to you. I think, for example, the Water Supply Sanitation Collaborative Council, that's a Geneva-based UN organization, came to us and said, look, we really want to try and understand what are the consequences of sanitation programs. Are the impact evaluations that are very then specific to WSSCC will help to inform them as to how they should stage their programs and how they should implement them and what results they can expect to see from their programs, which is very different from asking us as an outside organization to come and advise them on how their programs should be devised right from the beginning. So it's a little bit different. The idea is definitely after these impact evaluations are done, and I think we've moved a huge way away from how impact evaluations and a lot of these evaluations were looked at when they were first conceived. When they were first conceived in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s, they were thought of as essentially accountability exercises. I think we've come to the position where everyone sort of understands that a large part of the benefit of undertaking these evaluations is really the learning for the program and the learning for the policy. And you can actually start adapting your policy and program while you're undertaking these evaluations. And that's really the value added. It's not so much this big aha moment that's going to come at the end, that's going to give you a big shocker. It's really how you can keep learning from these programs from these evaluations as you start to develop them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. You mentioned earlier that the demand for your services and the demand for evidence-based learning, as you're saying, is just, it's far too great than what you can provide and what other organizations like you can provide. What's the next 5 years look like? Are you guys acquiring talent and building your network as quickly as possible to meet that demand? Are you connecting with other organizations to try to meet that demand? Are you looking at technologies that might help you to produce work faster? What's your roadmap for the next couple of years about how to do your job better?
Yeah, there's so much exciting stuff that's happening in in this space that it's sort of hard to keep track. But I think I'm going to mention a couple of things that are happening that really excite me. The first one is data. Yeah, the big focus on not so much rapid data, but big data. Big data, the geographically disaggregated data, satellite data, aerial photographs, etc. I started to look at this when I was working in the World Bank many years ago. And at that time, it was expensive and it was hard to just bring on the gigabytes and gigabytes of data that you had and to really reconcile it with, say, a survey or something like that. It's a radical change in the way you would think about information and data now. And I think that's changing the way we are thinking about how we can learn and how we can program and how we can evaluate. One example is, so we have a pretty large program with the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa and IFAD and DFID, which is funded by DFID and by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that's looking at agricultural innovation and what induces farmers to really adopt agricultural innovation. And these are smallholder farmers. A long time ago, you really had to go and collect a lot of the individual as well as plot level data, etc. Now you have soil maps that are high resolution, 1 meter resolution, 5 meter resolution that you can use and you can combine with a lot of the very well collected survey data, and you can turn around impact evaluations very quickly. So that, I think, is really exciting for me. The second thing, somewhat unrelated, is really the use of behavioral science and how people have started to use it for informing the effectiveness of programs. You've probably heard of the Behavioral Insights Unit in London.
This is the nudge group?
The Nudge group, right. But I think the reason that that's exciting, and very little of that work is happening with developing countries, and that's why I think it's a really great space, because there are good policies in the sense that they're well-intentioned, and then there are well-intentioned policies, and there are well-intentioned people, and yet that policies fail. That big missing middle is, for me, I think, going to be informed by behavioral insights.
It sounds to me like you're kind of touching on a topic here where something we spoke about, not only on this show, but in other places as well, where, for instance, you're putting evidence out there about what works in development, but a policymaker will still go with their gut. Or even the development professional will still kind of go with their gut about what they know how to do, and they'll stay in their comfort zone rather than trying that new thing. Does that make sense?
Sure, but I think if there's overwhelming evidence, it's hard to ignore it, and I think that's sort of part of the position.
I don't know about that, Joe. There seems to be a lot of overwhelming evidence out there about a lot of things that we
overwhelming high quality evidence.
Okay, there you go.
I'm an optimist, but I think nevertheless I do think that if it's high quality and if you can really explain what the evidence is saying, and I have to confess, I haven't seen high quality evidence, what people call high quality evidence, very frequently.
Break that down for me. What that would be great. Someone sitting in your position who, you're a funding organization, you are, your daily job is to make sure that high quality evidence happens. Define that for me. So that the people who are listening to this show know, what would they need to show up with that would be high quality for you?
Yeah, great. So 3IE defines it in a very, very strict way. We want to see evidence that can help to relate the program or the intervention or the policy that you're looking at to the outcome that you want to measure, right? So, for example, you have cash on one side and you see improvement in people's condition on the other side. So if people come to me and say, oh, well, here's a great report, we, as soon as cash was inserted into this community or for internally displaced people became better off, and we saw improvements in anthropometric measures, but we also saw improvements in livelihoods. My first question is going to be, how do you know? Have you taken care of the biases that are clearly inherent in this? So many confounding factors. And most evidence does not deal with the strength of this causal relationship and forget measuring it. Forget, even saying that, yes, this is being measured, that this is being measured well. But just to be able to say that, yes, there is a causal relationship and I can tell you what the strength of that causal relationship is, and that actually the cash insertion contributed a 10% change to the overall change in the livelihood conditions of people. That is what will constitute high quality evidence for me, which is not to say that you shouldn't use, descriptive, normative, summative work essentially to inform yourself. But that's not evidence about whether the program itself is working or not. So first you need to have that causal relationship. Second, you need to be able to say, this is the strength of it, or this is the amount of change that my program is bringing about, and I can attribute it to the program. Third, I do want to be able to say that this is when it works and this is when it doesn't work. Fourth, I do want to be able to say that this is how confident I am about this relationship. Fifth and sixth, I do want to be also able to say what the costs are vis-a-vis the overall change in my outcomes and the overall change in the conditions that I'm looking at. Because you have to be able to say whether it was worth it, finally. Last but not least is also be able to tell me, who is it working for? Is it just working for the rich? Is it working only for the men? Is it only working for a certain subgroup of society? Or is it working across the board? So those are just sort of some of the few attributes that I'm looking for when I'm looking at good evidence.
So far, according to your website here, I'm looking at it right now, 3IE has given away just over 84 million US dollars in grants, and those grants are used for impact evaluation, systematic reviews, and other studies. Where does the money come from? How do you stay? Are you committed to independence? Do you go out and seek funding to continue to build your coffers, and then you're a mechanism that assures that good evaluations are happening, or do you have an endowment? How does that work?
Yeah. So we have core donors. When we started off, BMGF, DFID, Hewlett, and a few others came on as core donors for 3IE. We are a membership-based organization. So members also make contributions to our core funds. But then we also support what are called thematic windows that are really driven by demand. And we have precisely 13 thematic windows. So these range in topics from social protection to agricultural risk, understanding what works to increase the uptake of agricultural risk instruments, that is, or sanitation. So our latest window is really going to be looking at what works to reduce open defecation in India. And these are all driven by donors who essentially say they want to see the evidence because this is going to help them to make decisions around policy priorities, but it's also going to help other agencies see the evidence and inform themselves. So there's a public good character to it, as well as definitely the perspective of the donor that we do consider. Having said which, I think there are two things in our remit which we are very clear about. One is that all of the evidence that we produce and support and quality assure needs to be put out in the public domain so that it is available for everyone to see. It's freely accessible and hopefully usable. The second is that we are independent, and so we will articulate that at the beginning. We do bring on experts, so we have a large network of experts that are located in universities and consulting firms, primarily universities though, across the world. And that helps us to keep ahead of the game, so to speak, in terms of sector knowledge, in terms of methodological approaches, and in terms of just the discipline. So it's sort of a combination, but I think what is important for us is that these should be questions that are really relevant for people out there when they're making their decisions. And it shouldn't just be academics who want to look at questions that they're really interested in on one side, but are also best trained to deal with. So essentially cherry picking questions that they can answer.
Mm-hmm. Does that network include other organizations like Evidence Action, IPA, these other organizations that are very focused on building evidence and development programming? Would they be your grantees, or are they partners, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the IPA is a partner. I beg your pardon. IPA is a grantee. JPAL is a grantee as well as a partner. So partner essentially is essentially a term that we use to indicate that we have a fairly wide network of organizations that we work with to create really a critical mass of not just evidence, but also awareness around the importance of generating high quality evidence. So we work with our grantees pretty closely, and we work with a whole host of organizations that believe in the same remit.
I know that on your title, not only are you the Deputy Executive Director and the Head of Evaluation for 3IE, but you're also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia. Is that, do most of the people within the organization wear two hats like that and, sort of keep your tools sharp while also contributing to the organization, or is that pretty common?
I don't think anyone else does, actually.
Oops, so there you go. You're an outlier.
I didn't think of it as being an outlier, but I think the organization does encourage it. We've only now really, Stephen, come to a size where, we have, I think, just a bit more than 60 people across the world. So we have 3 offices and we have some bit more than 60 people. But really, we've grown rapidly over the past 8 years. But I remember I joined a little bit more than 4 years ago, and there was one person in the evaluation office other than me. We're about 20 people just in the evaluation office, and 3Is, I think, tripled in size or something. So it's been very rapid. Just to say that when I came, I was already doing this at Columbia, and Howard at that time, he did have 2 hats. So I think that sort of made him sympathetic, but also he sort of understood the importance of keeping skills sharp, etc. And I encourage that. I think all of us do on the senior team.
I know you talked about big data a little bit ago. You talked about, especially sensory data, geographic data, those kinds of things. Are there other disruptions in either the development space or specifically, the research and impact evaluation space that have affected your work over the past couple of years that you think are really important? And I'm thinking about things like, we all, it's obvious, we all know mobile phones are bringing us data that is rapidly increasing, but are there methodologies? Is it general awareness about the need for evidence? Is there other things that are surprisingly disruptive that have changed the way you do your work?
So I wouldn't call them disruptive. I think that there has been a huge change in this field, and data and mobile data has definitely been one of them. But I think the other big thing that has affected this discipline is, on one side, a tightening of the purse strings. So development assistance essentially shrinking, but then the flip side of that has been a far greater attention paid to understanding whether programming works or not. So like I said, I wouldn't call it a disruption. There's been an opportunity, I think, that has been created from each one of these things. One realizes that because there is a far greater amount of attention that's being paid to to effectiveness, there are small organizations. There's the UN and different parts of the UN that are coming to me and saying, well, we really want to understand whether our programs are working or not. That didn't happen when I joined, for example, in 2012. We really had to, go and beg them to think about producing evidence for their programs.
What was the tipping point? Did you have any idea?
I don't think it was one discrete event, but like I said, I know that the ODA, Official Development Assistance, has moved toward focusing on humanitarian assistance, which has meant, and that has been a big change for the entire world. I think that just made people much more sensitive, and this greater attention to governance, to really. And to implementation. I think a lot of these things have come alongside, but they've been sort of corollaries of this bigger, larger movement that has been about tightening of the purse string. So for me, I think that's been the big change. I think the other big change has been, of course, the discussions around climate change. Surprisingly for me, very few organizations still think about evidence in that space, I think, and that's something that people are still sort of coming to grips with. I think those are sort of it.
Joe, just two more questions for you that I'm asking everybody these days on the Terms of Reference podcast. The first one is, who do you pay attention to? When you're out there, either surfing the net, are there blogs or podcasts other than, of course, this one, or other people that you pay attention to not only to keep your tools sharp, but also stay attuned to what's up and coming, what's new, what's innovative?
I think for us is we're constantly looking for good researchers that are really bucking the trend in terms of methods. For me, that's even more important than anything else that I spoke about, primarily because most impact evaluation work that gets done has really been held hostage by the disciplines that most PhDs have been trained in. That essentially means that there's a gestation period of almost 5 years between someone recognizing that, yes, there is 5 years at least. There's someone recognizing that, yes, there is a important, interesting question to be answered, and then getting the training, assuming, of course, that there are good PhD programs that are training all of these young people to use tools across different silos. So I'm saying that in a very convoluted way, but essentially what has been strange for me has been how difficult it is to really get people to innovate and look outside of the silos of the disciplines that they've been trained in, and to think about new areas that clearly have not even entered the academic department program or departments or programs yet, but really to get them to innovate and think about stuff, to think about methodologies, etc., in an innovative way and to push the frontier. And that, I think, takes a lot of time, but it's also been, I think, one of the bigger tragedies of our times, that we're still so hamstrung by what we already know, and that because most academics at least will want to produce good papers that get published in top journals. So I'm constantly looking for people who are willing to take the risk and innovate a little bit and push the frontier. And so we're happy in most of the programs that we end up supporting. We try and look for people who are new and are thinking in fresh ways about questions and how to answer them.
I really appreciate that perspective. And the thing that was popping in my mind while you were describing that was a 5-year arc for someone to, get training, find a question, then start answering that question. I mean, that's just forever when we talk about the volumes of data that sort of Facebook is producing today, or Google, or whoever. 5 years from now, the universe will be completely different. We're going to be on Mars, according to Elon Musk, right? So that's just really that's really interesting to wonder how we can bring those very different timing expectations, align them better so that we're producing. Does that make sense?
And one of the things that we've started to do, Stephen, is that we insist on the impact evaluation teams that are multidisciplinary and use mixed methods and all of that. And again, the way even I use that term, sort of a multidisciplinary term, the way I used it 4 years ago is radically different from the way I use it now. I mean different things because I know that there's such a lot of sectoral sort of leaping that's required, and just in terms of breaking through barriers, etc., in terms of thinking, that you have to take advantage of it. And it really takes a village to put together good studies.
Final question for you, and sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't, but is there an innovation either inside 3IE or something that you've kind of just, you've seen out there while you've been participating in the development or humanitarian community? Is there one that you really like to geek out on, you're super excited about, you think it's super cool, even though it may not relate to your work at all?
I want to go back to the nudge stuff. I think for me that's really the coolest part because it really speaks to implementation science, and it really speaks to the how and the why rather than the how much and the what. I think we sort of know now, what works in sort of the meta sense of the word and how much it works, or if it doesn't work, etc. I think the big questions for us are really on the ground. How does one do it? And when it works, why does it work? So it's really closing that chasm. That's really exciting for me. I think about it a lot. And I'm really hoping that we can do something around that at 3i as well. Well, we are going to be doing it actually. So in our newest window for sanitation and open defecation, which is a big problem in India, one of the big challenges is there are lots of toilets and latrines that are built, but people don't use them. 563 million people don't use toilets. They'd rather go out in the open. What can make people change their behavior? They have the infrastructure, they're just not using it. So that's where we are.
Jo, thank you so very much for taking your evening to spend some time with us tonight. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.